السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأصلي وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين، أما بعد. Welcome to another halaqah of the Qasas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets from the Quran itself. Now, one thing I'm doing actually is I'm mostly using the Quran as the springboard. Obviously, sometimes I will bring things from the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the reason I'm saying this is because quite often many of the stories that we're going to take from the Quran regarding certain prophets, I might skip some parts of their life that people who have read the seerahs of the prophets, they will be saying, Dr. Ahmed, you skipped this part, right? I'm very well aware that I skipped certain parts because I'm focusing mainly on the Quran verses. Sometimes I'll make an exception just to fill in the gaps of information because the verse of Quran might mention part and then jump to another part, but without that background, we might not understand what is happening over here, right? Where does things fall into place? So we're still continuing with the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and if I remember correctly, where we left off last week was the debate that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with Namrud. Is that right? And how that ended. Now, I did not mention that many of the books of Sirah mention that afterwards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed the Namrud because he refused to follow Ibrahim alayhi salam. And then did I mention? So afterwards, after that whole debate, Ibrahim alayhi salam then left, right? Left with whoever he had believed with him. And along with him was his nephew, Lut alayhi salam. What I did not mention also was that among the people that left with Ibrahim was Sarah. Sarah, who ended up being the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, some of the books of Sirah mention that Sarah was the cousin of Ibrahim alayhi salam. I honestly did not investigate the authenticity of that claim, but in many of the books of the Sirah, they will say that she was the cousin of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Which brings me to an important point. We have to differentiate between what is Islamically permissible, what is historically permissible, and what sometimes culturally influences us, right? Sometimes we come from a culture that, the cousin is treated as a sibling, right? She's my sister, or he's my brother. For all due purposes, and unfortunately, what happens is because of that cultural ideology, people do practice that. Like they treat their cousin, their first cousin, male or female. So if a male, for example, has a female cousin or a female has a male cousin, they literally treat them as brothers and sisters, which means the physical contact that is there between shaking hands or hugs or appearing without the appropriate Islamic attire, or even the sense of disgust of the mentioned idea of a cousin getting married to another cousin. That is cultural influence. That is not Islamic regulation. We have to differentiate between both of that. We have to remember that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places something in the religion, this is what it is. The Prophet ﷺ himself married his first cousin, right? We have an example over here also, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he married his cousin. And so cousins are not your siblings, right? So I'm just kind of mentioning this. Sometimes it's important to kind of remind ourselves with some of these things that perhaps might, because of our cultural norms, influence us in the wrong way, right? طيب. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he traveled, the next story in the Quran quite often talks about al-Bala al-Azim, right? Which is the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam with Ismail. But before we get to that, I have to fill in some of the background of how that occurred, right? So it's talking about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered Ibrahim alayhi salam to sacrifice his son. But if you notice, there's a huge jump between the travel of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then all of a sudden, Isa alayhi salam, right? Of course, there's the whole story about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering Ibrahim alayhi salam to leave his wife Hajar, which we need to fill in that. I just mentioned the wife is Sarah. So where did Hajar come from? And he leaving his son in the desert, right? And then the whole aspect of ordering to slaughter him. And so there's a bit of a, there's a picture taken from the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam and mentioned, and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ fill in the gaps. I'm going to mention just some of those gaps quickly until we get to the whole order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering Ibrahim alayhi salam to sacrifice Ismail alayhi salam. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam had left Iraq, right? Essentially, he headed towards Asham and Egypt, and along with him was his wife Sarah. And then when Ibrahim alayhi salam entered one of the lands, so there's there's some of the scholars mention which land it was, others don't. Those who mentioned which land it was, they just mentioned it was Egypt. And so when he entered the area of Egypt, the person who ruled that area, which quite often we refer to as a Fir'aun. Fir'aun is a title, by the way. It's not a name, right? Pharaoh is a title, Fir'aun. So the king of Egypt is called Fir'aun. The king of the Roman Empire is called Qaisar. In English, Caesar, right? The Persian Empire king is called Kisra. Kisra, okay? And then Al-Habasha, the king of Al-Habasha, Ethiopia, is called Najashi, okay? So those are all titles, by the way. So Najashi just means it's a title for a king, right? Qaisar is a title for a king. Kisra is a title for a king. Fir'aun is a title for a king. So those are not names of individuals. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he tells to Musa alayhi salam, اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى, he didn't mean, he's just mean go to the king, for he has transgressed, he's oppressed people. He didn't mention the name of that king. Later on, this is something that's mentioned in history. But anyway, so the Fir'aun of that place, of the Egypt, was a tyrant. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he entered that land, when he left his people, right? And he left with Sarah and he came that area. Sarah, by the way, was known to be exceptionally beautiful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed her with beauty that is that is equivalent or parallel to the beauty of Hawa. Hawa, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created her, he created her in extreme beauty. And so it was mentioned that Sarah was also shared that same kind of beauty that Hawa radiallahu anha had. And so she was when she walks in an area, people notice that. And so one of the, I guess the people of Pharaoh, Fir'aun, or the king of that area noticed Sarah, and he went to him and he said, there's a man that entered your territory and he has a woman that with him that is so beautiful that she's only befit of a person like you. Right? She's only befit to a person like you. Now, unfortunately, this king was a tyrant, and so it seemed that he had sent for Ibrahim alayhi salam to call him to in his presence, and he asked him. He said, "Who is this woman with you?" Right? Who's this woman with you? And subhanAllah, Ibrahim alayhi salam perhaps realized and felt what was going to happen, and so he told him, "She is my sister." Okay? He told him, "She is my sister." Now, I want you to just remember for this for a second, okay? Now, I'm saying this because it sounds like a lie, right? It sounds like a lie. We have to be careful what we say about prophets, okay? So, it seems like it, and we're going to explain that, right? And the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So this, by the way, this story comes from hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ says, that Ibrahim alayhi salam, this is on the day of judgment when they ask for intercession, and Ibrahim alayhi salam say, I lied 3 lies, but if you look at them, they're not lies. We're going to explain what they are. That is true, but we'll explain what it is, Sheikh. It was not a lie. In Arabic, it's called tawriya. Right? It's called tawriya. And we're going to explain what it is, inshallah. But anyway, so he said, she's my sister. The reason behind it, because he realized that this king obviously is going to want to have Sarah. And if she has a husband, he needs to get rid of that husband, right? But if this person is a brother or a friend or a cousin or whatever the case is, khalas, there's nothing happening. And so then he wanted to call Sarah in his presence. When Ibrahim alayhi salam went to Sarah, he told her, if he asks you what's my position to you, just tell him that you're my sister. Do not say any otherwise, so that's his saddiqini, which means align your story with my story essentially, right? And he told her, tell him you are my sister, because there are no Muslims in this land besides me and you. So when he said she's my sister, he's referring to my sister in what? In Islam, right? So if you notice, this was the intention, right? So it was not a lie, it's called a tawriya. Sometimes you're forced in a position where your life is in threat. You're not necessarily lying, but you're saying the truth with a specific intention that it's not a lie, right? The other person can understand whatever way they want to understand it, but this is only done in extreme positions, right? In extreme situations where, for example, your life is in a threat, or there's some danger, something is going to happen to you. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because, mashallah, some of the brothers and sisters, especially the young ones, they're very talented about using this on a daily basis, right? And they will say, and you ask them, did you say this? He's like, yeah, but I meant this, right? And like, okay, like if it happened once, it's okay, but if it happens a lot, right, there's something wrong. Okay, this is not something that should be used quite often. Okay, and like people who are married, wives and husbands, right? It's okay to sometimes use that also, but don't use it quite often, because you get in trouble. You get caught. You will get caught eventually, right? And this is more. It's used in a way to kind of bring more mawadda, right? Love and affection between the spouses, right? In certain ways that are considered befitting, right? It might not necessarily be considered the complete truth, but you're doing it in order to bring more of the hearts and reconcile between one another. But those done in certain situations, it's not the habit and all these things. But anyway, I'm mentioning this because, once again, prophets do not lie. They do not commit sins. They're infallible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected from that. And so when Ibrahim alayhi salam said this is what he's referring to, right? It outwardly seems like that. And remember, because this is the state of prophets, they fear things more, and they hold themselves to a higher standard than other people. And so in their eyes, what is considered a sin is not in reality a sin. Similar to, for example, the pious individual who might view permissible things as huge things he should not commit. Other regular people say that this is permissible, right? And the dislikes of the regular people is like the haram of the righteous. Right, like the righteous person will be like, I can't do something that's makruh. It's almost, he feels like it's a sin, right? While most people, they're like, it's just makruh, don't worry about it, right? Just engage in it. Well, in reality, I'll be honest with you, it's makruh because it's disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And those are like buffer zones, right? Because once you enter one, you're going to probably enter the next. So if you stay, for example, in the mustahabbat, don't enter the permissible, then you will not enter the makruh. If you enter the permissible, you might enter the makruh. If you enter the makruh, you might enter the haram, right? If you enter some of them haram, then you most likely enter into the major sins. It is buffer zones, right? It's a good idea to keep a distance between yourself and the other stuff. And so engages in more righteous actions will prevent you from engaging too much in the permissible, which will keep you away from the makruh, which will definitely keep you away from the haram. Wallahu alam. But anyway, so the king had called Sarah, and he asked her, who's this? And she kind of mentioned it. But when the king saw Sarah, he could not help himself, and he immediately went to touch her, right? And Sarah had made a dua, right? She said, oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I believe in you. And if my faith is true, then keep him away, right? Allahumma kfinihim bima shit, right? This is, of course, when the person had come. I'm just going to forget to mention something. So when the person came to call Sarah, Ibrahim alayhi salam went to start praying, right? Because it's a state of stress. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam started worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Sarah had went to that king to see him. And so she said, Allahumma inni kunti ta'lam anni amantu bika wa bi rasulik wa ahsanta farji illa ala zawji fala tusallit alayya al-kafir. Right? She said, "Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you know that I believed in you and I believed in your messenger and I kept myself chaste except for my husband, then please do not let a disbeliever, right, be something over me." And so when he went to extend his hand towards her, he got paralyzed. His hand got paralyzed, right? And so when this happened, he said, "Make dua to Allah, right? And I'm not going to harm you." And so she made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to release him because she was afraid if this continues, then she might herself be punished, right? And so once this happened, he went to reach for her out again, right? And when he did that second time, his hand got crippled, and it was even worse than the first time. In some narrations, he actually was afflicted for something in Arabic. It's called a sara. Sara is a what's the word for sara? Seizure. He went into a seizure, right? And he said, "Make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieve me. I'm not going to harm you." And so she did that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, removed that from him. And then he went again for the third time, right, to touch her. But that third time was even the far worse, right? And so he told her, "Make dua and I'm not going to harm you." And so she made dua. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cured him. And he called the person that called her. He said, "You did not bring a human being, you brought a shaitana," right? Send her away. But then he also sent with her Hajar as a servant, because he found out that she is an individual that works by her hand, right, for doing her domestic things. And he said, "She's not a person who's befit to do things by her hand. Give her Hajar." And so she went back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. When she entered his house, Ibrahim alayhi salam was still praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping. And he asked her what happened. She said, "Khayran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected me and I was gifted Hajar." Right? And so this was the story there. And I'm mentioning it because this is how Hajar came into the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, as they moved to somewhere else more, they moved to the Bilad al-Sham, close to Al-Quds and those areas. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to trial Ibrahim alayhi salam and his wife Sarah to not bless them with children. Right? She was barren. She could not give children, even until the age that Ibrahim alayhi salam was about 85, 86. Now, Ibrahim alayhi salam loved his wife Sarah, and he never complained about not having any children. However, Sarah knew that Ibrahim alayhi salam wanted children, and she was only a few years, about 5 to 10 years younger than, I'm talking about Hajar, I'm talking about Sarah. She's about 5 to 10 years younger than Ibrahim alayhi salam, which means that she was also now at an old age, where most likely she will not be able to bear any children. So what she decided to do was to give Hajar to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam married her. And this is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with a Ismail alayhi salam. Right? And you can imagine the happiness of Ibrahim alayhi salam after the age of 86. He was given a child. And this was his only child, right? This was from Hajar. As his affection grew towards that newborn, Sarah alayhi salam seemed to have felt some sort of jealousy, but whatever the reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered Ibrahim alayhi salam to take his wife Hajar and Ismail alayhi salam and take him to a specific place, which is now what we call Mecca, right? And leave them there. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, now we have to remember, this is obviously a place that is, I want you to imagine the sensation or the feelings of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he's doing this. Remember, this is his only child after an old age, right? A person who gets something after a long period of time tends to be attached to it very much, tends to love it, no matter what it is, let it alone being a child, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he took his wife Hajar in the designated area, and this was mentioned in the Quran. إِنِّي تَرَكْتُ ذُرِّيَّتِي فِي وَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ. Surah Ibrahim, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, once he arrived to the dedicated spot, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him to leave Hajar and his newborn in it, if he looked around, it was just a barren desert. There's nothing there. There's no water, no oasis, no trees, no buildings, just mountains, right? Mountains and complete desert. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he left his wife and Ismail alayhi salam. And I know you guys heard the story a lot, but I'm going to hopefully, inshallah, just fill in a few things, just going to take some lessons from it. And he just turned around and left without speaking. Now, why would he do that? Why would he turn around without speaking? Huh? I know, but if let's say you're gonna driving in a car, and you take your wife and your kid, you put them outside, and you turn around and leave without talking. Is that normal? Obviously not, right? I hope it's not normal, right? I'd be very concerned if this was the regular habit. Huh? No, ya Sheikh, it should not be normal. Why would he not say anything? Huh? He said? It's not that he could not justify. Think about his emotional, psychological state. Of course it's an order, ya Shaykh, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, I hope, so no sane person would leave people in a desert without anything. All he did was left her with like 2 bags of food and some water, a container of water. And whether we like it or not, no matter how much you try to ration out what you have, it will run out. It will run out, right? And so this is why Hajar, as he turned around and he left, she said, "Where are you leaving us? Where are you leaving us?" And he did not respond. The only time he responded when she asked, "Allahu amarak," did Allah order you? And this is when he nodded his head, right? But prior to that, he did not respond, because you can imagine how hard it is, right, on an individual to go through with something like this, right? To separate, from his wife and his only child that he has, that is an infant. By any logical measures, you're sending them essentially to death, right? You're leaving them to die essentially. But remember, Ibrahim alayhi salam had an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then he understands that's an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he trusts Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what's amazing also is Hajar also understood that. Because the minute that he told her that, yes, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she said, إِذَنْ لَا يُضَيُّعَنَ اللَّهِ, right? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not put us in a state of loss. He will protect us, right? So I want you to look at not just so we understand that this is a prophet, he will obey, but now this is an individual, it's not a prophet, right? SubhanAllah, the extent of the iman that she had, that this is an order, then it must be good for us, right? And this is important for us to understand. Of course, we're not receiving revelations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And anyone who claims to receive from revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needs to check their position, right? But put it in a situation where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed something upon us, right? Whether He decreed that we not get a certain job, or get a job that is less, or not get the house that we want, or get a house that is less, or be, for example, afflicted with a certain sickness, or not given, whatever that Allah gave us in terms of taqdeer, from His qadr, okay? Do we accept it or we do not accept it? Do we trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that or not? Even though sometimes it might look like this is going to result in our death, or lack of living a life that is comfortable, for example, right? But we have to because we don't know what's in the future. The reality is we don't know what's in the future. We might project a negative view of the future, but in reality we do not know what's in the future. But it's that belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gives a person a sense of hope, because we're thinking of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed us here for a reason, or did this for a reason, then it must be good. That turns any situation from a stressful situation with a negative, bleak out view, right, or end, to a more of a positive one. Trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so she said, إِذَا لَا يُضَيُّعَنَ اللَّهِ. And Ibrahim alayhi salam walked away. Now I'm going to walk with Ibrahim for a little bit and I'm going to come to Hajar. As Ibrahim alayhi salam was walking, the books of Sirah mentioned that the shaitan tried to stop him how many times? 3 times, right? Now I'm bringing this because this is where our entire or the majority of our ritual of Hajj comes from, right? It is that original story, the beautiful story of the best example of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that was presented to us by Ibrahim and his family, right? By his entire family, him, his wife, and his child, right? So he came to him the first time and he said, you're leaving your, your children, whatever the case is. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, what did he do? He threw pebbles at him, right? And in those 3 positions, this is where we symbolically throw the al-aqaba al-kubra wal-sughra wal-wusta, right? If you're going from Mina towards Mecca, it's sughra, wusta, then kubra. Kubra is the closest to Mecca, right? And so you throw it in those 3. So it is a symbolic, essentially, act of ritual. It is an act of ritual, but it symbolizes us expressing our rejection of the shaitan, our declaration of taking the shaitan as our enemy. We're not going to listen to him. Similar to how Ibrahim alayhi salam refused to listen to the waswasa of the shaitan to try to direct him away or prevent him from obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, after he did that, he continued and he walked away. Let's go back to Hajar and Ismail alayhi salam. Obviously there is, there's a heat of the sun. Whatever shelter I think she could try to be in the shade, she started in the shade. She rationed the food and drink as much as she can, but eventually it did run out, right? And when the food ran out, she could no longer nurse Ismail alayhi salam. And so naturally as an infant, what is he going to do? He's going to cry. But did Hajar alayhi salam, did she give up hope at that moment? No, she didn't, right? She still obviously trusted in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And she started, looking for something, trying to search for people so that she can call for them for help. Obviously, they know that there are certain caravans, trade routes that go by certain areas. Obviously, not in this area because there's nothing there. Caravans and trade routes try to hit spots and areas where there is perhaps, a pathway to some sort of a oasis or some sort of a water well that is known. But Hajar, what she did, she started going from the Safa, standing up, looking for people, if there's somebody there, then coming down, running to the other side, Marwa, and searching for people. And she would do that, leaving Ismail alayhi salam crying, right, because he is hungry. The reason she did that is because she didn't trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She did, but she was acting upon the worldly means while trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so it means that when we trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it does not mean that we just sit there and do nothing, but we take the means depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created those means, and He is the one that by His mercy and creation will allow these means to bring fruit or not, based on the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the same as when a companion came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, my camel, right, should I depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and leave it, it'll stay there and it'll come back to me, or should I tie it? Right? Mean, should I depend on worldly reasons or depend on Allah? And the Prophet ﷺ told him what? اعقلها وتوكل. اعقلها, which means tie your camel. It's kind of funny, when I was younger, people thought اعقلها means think about it, right? وَهُزِّ إِلَيْكِ بِجَذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ. Yes, we can get to that inshallah. That is so I'm going to get to that in this. That's a good example. I wasn't going to say it, but I will mention inshallah. And so over here, he told the companion, no, tie it, take the means, and then depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He allow these means that He created for you to work and protect your camel. Right? Now, the Shaykh over here, he can mention also a good example of that was Maryam alayhi salam, when she gave birth to Isa alayhi salam. And in the Quran it depicts that she gave birth close to a tree, right? and that tree had fruit, and after, like, she gave birth, she was weak, she needed food. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, like, made Isa alayhi salam speak and tell her, هزي إليك بجذع النخلة, shake the trunk of the tree, right? تساقط عليك رطبا جنية, right? It will drop down for you rutab, which is fresh dates. Now I want you to think about this. Have you ever tried to shake a palm tree before? Did you guys ever try to shake a palm tree? Huh? Well, if it's a small tree, I understand, right? If it's a small part, I understand. But these palm trees, they tend to grow, right? If you shake it, will something happen? I know there's no palm trees here except in, like, certain areas. There's a lot of apple trees here. Have you seen apple trees before? Right? Go to the bigger ones. If you shake it, are you able to shake it? لا يا شيخ, not shake the trunk itself, not the branch. I'm not talking about the branch. The trunk itself, can you shake the trunk? Okay, so I want you to think about this. A woman just gave birth. Isa, as an infant, is telling her, shake the trunk. Is that humanly possible? But you just take the means, right? Do something, and Allah will bring those means to fruit, if He wills, right? Same thing as, اعقلها, tie it, and depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But anyway, that's what Hajar was doing. She was going from back and forth, back and forth. Now this is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of her submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and her complete dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always reward the person. And this is when He sent Jibreel alayhi salam to strike with his wing underneath the feet of, I'm confusing the names of the prophets, of Ismail alayhi salam, right? And this is where Zamzam sprouted. Now, interesting information. The Prophet ﷺ said, may Allah have mercy on Hajar. If she would have left Zamzam flow, it would have turned into a river. It would have turned into a river. What did she do when the water sprouted? What did she do? Yes, she gathered, like, things around it so that it would fill with water. So she formed almost like a well basin type of deal, right? Because she was concerned, she wanted to kind of collect that water. It wouldn't just go anywhere, and she collected it. But of course, she would not have known this. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Zamzam is something that is unique, that truly, if it would have left, it would have turned into an entire river in the Arabian Peninsula, right? Perhaps, wallahu alam, this is why until this day, the well of Zamzam still flows. I mean, imagine how many thousand years, how many millions of people drink from it a year, and they even send Zamzam to Medina, they send Zamzam to other areas, and all these things. The water is still there, subhanAllah, right? It's a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this is where the whole Zamzam aspect happens, but also the Safa and Marwa, the ritual of the Safa and Marwa occurred, right? طيب. So this brings us to the time where now, okay, khalas, Ismail is in Mecca. Ibrahim alayhi salam went back to Iraq. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, obviously when he went back, it was based on the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the messengers do things because they're ordered to. He did not abandon his wife and his children. He didn't do that. And I'm stressing on this because unfortunately we have some distorted minds with interesting thought that would accuse prophets with things that are not true, like abandoning their families. But we know that this is not true, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered them. And this is why Ibrahim also alayhi salam, he would often come to visit his wife and his child. He would travel again from Iraq to Mecca, stay there, make sure they're okay, and then travel back again. Now, just to give you a quick background of what happened next, as the water kind of started flowing, naturally if there's water, there's birds that kind of fly around because there's water. And so a tribe, one of the tribes, the Arabian Peninsula tribes, were traveling by, and they saw birds and they realized there's something there. And so they went to that area and they found Hajar and Ismail with this water well. And they asked her, can we have a share of this? She said, no, it belongs to me, but you can drink from it. And this is how the civilization of Mecca and the people around it started happening. And this is how Ismail alayhi salam also grew among the Arabs, and he started speaking the Arabic language. So Ismail alayhi salam was not from an Arab lineage. He's from lineage of Ibrahim alayhi salam. But essentially, this is where there's the lineage in the state in Palestine, right, or in Shem. Those were the prophets that turned later on to the tribes of Bani Israel. And then the branch from, later on, the Prophet ﷺ is from Ismail alayhi salam. Okay? So this is how the civilization in Mecca happened. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he would visit, now there's a community there, and he would check up on his children. And subhanAllah, year by year, his son would grow in front of his eyes, right? And the more his son would grow, the more affection the father is attached to him. Not just that, but this child was a very righteous child, right? And he was a prophet, and was an individual that would be dutiful to his parents. And and consider also the distance that Ibrahim alayhi salam would have to leave his child behind. You would tend to think about the child that's not with you even also a bit more. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the next thing that happens is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders Ibrahim alayhi salam to do what? Good. But when? He said, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيِ. Right? فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيِ. So, when Ismail alayhi salam grew enough to walk to places with his father, right? So that child is no longer an infant, but he grew, right? And once again, as a child grows, the more affection a person develops towards their child. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيِ قَالَ يَا بُنَيَّ إِنِّي أَرَى فِي الْمَنَامِ أَنِّي أَذْبَحُكَ فَانظُرْ مَاذَا تَرَى قال يا أبت افعل ما تؤمر ستجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين فلما أسلم وتلاه للجبين وناديناه يا إبراهيم أن قد صدقت الرؤيا إن كذلك نجزي المحسنين إن هذا لهو البلاء العظيم إن هذا لهو البلاء المبين إن هذا لهو البلاء المبين وفديناه بذبح عظيم. And so I'm going to start with just a translation and we're going to go into the details of this. And so the verse of the Quran said, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيِ, right? When Ismail alayhi salam reached an age where he can walk and go places with his father. So we're looking at the age of perhaps maybe 10 years old, 11 years old, somewhere in that area, right? 11, 12, maybe even a bit more 13, 14 perhaps. But he's going and back and forth with his father doing certain things. He said, so the verse says, قَالَ يَا بُنَيَّ, he said, my son. Right, my bunay, of course, the bunay is an endearing term. Similar like ya abati. So this is how Ibrahim had called his father. He said ya abati. But now, subhanAllah, we see, right, how he treats his son. His son, he says, ya bunay. He told him, ya bunay, inni ara fil manami an adbahuk. I see in my dream that I am slaughtering you. Fanzur ماذا ترى. Right? Fanzur, look and see what you think. What do you think about this? ماذا ترى. So Ismail alayhi salam responded and he said, قَالَ يَا أَبَتِي. I want you to notice how he speaks to his father. يَا أَبَتِي. Right? In an endearing form. إِفْعَلْ مَا تُؤْمَرْ. Do what you're being ordered. Now we're going to get to this. Ismail alayhi salam understood from the vision that it is a order. And he said, سَتَجِدُنِي إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مِنَ الصَّابِرِينَ. You'll find that I am from among, you're pointing to something, ya Shaykh. Yes. Yes. I'll get to that. طيب. And we'll answer why, right? We're going to explain why, right? So, but anyway, so he said, Ya abati fa'al, oh my father, do whatever you've been ordered. You will find me from the as-sabirin. As-sabirin is not just slightly patient, continuously extremely patient. And then the Quran says, فَلَمَّا أَسْلَمَا, when they both submitted, وَتَلَّهُ لِلْجَبِينَ, and he put his forehead down, right? So essentially he's getting to slaughter him. And then, وَنَادَيْنَاهُ أَيَّا إِبْرَاهِيم, and then we called him, O Ibrahim, قد صدقت الرؤيا, which means you fulfilled and acted upon the ru'ya, the vision, right? كذلك نجزي المحسنين. This is how we also rewarded the people of ihsan. إن هذا, this truly is لهو البلاء المبين, right? The clear bala, which means tribulation, right? A huge test. This is a clear, right? Huge test. And we're going to explain why. Like, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala call this a huge, clear test? Okay? Now I'm going to explain why considering that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذِبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ. فَدَيْنَاهُ, which means we ransomed him with a dhibh, with a huge, dhibhin azim, with a huge slaughter, which is the ram or the sheep. And this is why every Eid, what do? We slaughter, right? So if you notice, the majority of the things, we still haven't gotten to the Kaaba yet, and so we got over here to the sa'i, the throwing of the jamarat. We still have to get to the tawaf. This will be most likely next week, right? I'm just looking at the time. Because it has its own story, inshallah, in the Quran when it comes. So over here, why is this a huge, why is this like, a huge tribulation? Why is this a huge test for an individual? Well, because of multiple factors that gathered together, okay? First of all, and I mentioned this earlier, but we're going to bring this all together. One, Ibrahim alayhi salam was given children at an extremely old age, right? After longing for so long for a child, he was blessed with a child, which means that this is something that is extremely desirable, extremely loved. Can you part away with something like that? Type. Two, that this was his only child. We know later on he's going to be blessed with Ishaq, followed by Yaqub, and this is from his wife Sarah. But this did not happen yet, right? This will happen later on, okay? But for now, this is his only child, okay? And when you have one child, how much are you going to love that child? Quite often people with a single child, they tend to love them so much that they spoil them, they ruin them, right? They'll do everything for them. It's almost like, the children become the parents and the parents become the children. I don't know how it works, but the boss becomes the younger one and complete control, right? It's quite fascinating, subhanAllah. And the funny thing is the child knows they have that power, okay, over the parents. But anyway, this is an only child, which makes things a bit even more difficult. It's not like he had like, 10 or 20. He's like, yeah, I can get rid of one. It's okay. I still got like, 9 or 12 other children. No, but this was his only child, right? After desiring it for so long. The third is that this child was a very righteous child. A very dutiful child, right? He wasn't a troublemaker where he'd say, for example, Alhamdulillah, khalas, I'm gonna at least some hardship is gonna be gone. But no, this was a child that would do things to please his parents. Okay? That was very dutiful to his father, which means the affection was given him more. Fourth aspect, this child was also righteous, not just righteous, but he was a prophet. Right? Ismail alayhi salam was known to also be at a young age, he was a prophet. I want you also to add to that the nature of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam, what is his nature? Like, what is the state of his heart? What is he? Inna Ibrahim la'awwahun halim. Right? Ibrahim alayhi salam was very soft-hearted, right? Was very affectionate, very merciful. And so naturally that will also impact how he feels about his child. The sixth is that this child is going to die, right? Parents generally will do everything in their power to save their children, even if they have to give up their own life. Now, this child is not just going to die, but what kind of death he's going to die? He's going to be killed, right? Like, having a child killed is different than a child dying because of natural causes. SubhanAllah, like, the difficulty, level of difficulty that a person faces is a lot more. Now, after that this person who's going to be killed has to be killed by his father's own hand. The reason I'm mentioning this is because we have to understand why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it Al-bala'u al-mubin. Okay? Now also the way he was supposed to die is how? Slaughtering. Right? With a knife. It's not like from far away, or I'm going to throw you from somewhere and I'm going to not look, or I'm going to have somebody else do it. No. Compile all these things, you can now see the immense difficulty that is associated with going through with a decision like this. It is a bala' mubin. It is really a huge difficulty, right? And so when Ibrahim alayhi salam had to face this, what he did was he went to his son and he told him, he said, Ya bunay, inni ara fil manami anni adbahuk. Right? I see in my dream that I'm slaughtering you. فَانْظُرْ مَاذَا تَرَى. So we're going to get to the point of now, essentially he's asking his son, what do you think? Okay? Why did he do that? Now obviously Ibrahim a.s. knows that this is an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if it's an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it must be fulfilled. Right? Why did he ask Ismail then? Go ahead, Sheikh. طيب. There could be an opinion, but an order for me, an order to Ibrahim alayhi salam, is not an order to Ismail. That could be, but also I want you to think of something, right? Ordering one to do something is not an order for the other person. Does that make sense? And so, this was a way of out to Ismail. فَانْظُرْ مَاذَا تَرَى. So he did not tell him, okay, so Ibrahim did not tell him, Allah ordered me. Did Ibrahim tell him Allah ordered me? Ibrahim didn't tell him that. He said, I saw in the dream. Okay? I saw in my dream. He didn't tell him Allah ordered me. And Ibrahim a.s. was very careful of how he chose his words. He told him, what do you think, as perhaps a way that Ismail can perhaps get out of this? That Ismail has to accept it for this to happen. Yes. I understand. But you have to understand the dynamics of what's happening, right? So Ismail alayhi salam, wallahu alam, had a choice. It's not that he did not have a choice, right? It's an order to Ibrahim that he has to go through the action. But there's another individual in the process. He was not ordered to obey, right? But yes, it is true. So essentially he was telling him, Ismail, you might have a choice out of this, right? Once again, he could have told him, Allah had ordered me to do something. Because we know that the vision or the dreams of the prophets is a revelation. Okay, dreams of the prophets, only the prophets, it's an order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, he did not want to give it the clear covering that this is an order, you must obey me, you have to do this. He wanted to give his son a choice, but perhaps also maybe to submit in the reward. That's one of the opinions that is there. But also a way, but Ismail alayhi salam, right? What I want to turn to is look at also Ismail alayhi salam's submission. By the way, you accepting death upon yourself is not an easy decision, is it? Essentially, Ismail alayhi salam is saying, kill me. Okay? Kill me. And so Ismail alayhi salam understood that this was an order. This is why he told him, if'al ma tu'mar. He didn't just say yes, but he also encouraged his father, Ibrahim alayhi salam, to fulfill the order. All right? And this is something we can learn from, from our own circle. We need to encourage one another to fulfill Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders. no matter sometimes how difficult the decision might be. And sometimes we are faced with those decisions because we need to prove our submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might means that we have to leave behind a very lucrative opportunity, for example. Right? We might have to, for example, end up losing some sort of a monetary gain if we obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we may have to accept certain things that might cause some sort of a bit of a hardship. But as family members, we need to really uphold this and encourage each one another, right? To obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if it's difficult. Some level of difficulty is expected. This is what proves a person who truly is sincere from a person who's not. Yes. And so Ismail alayhi salam, right? He responded to his father. He said, "If'al ma tu'mar," right? To do what you are ordered, right? Do your order. So he's encouraging his father, and this is from the manners of Ismail alayhi salam with Allah subhanahu wa taala, right? So once again, he didn't tell him do this action. He said, "No, do what Allah ordered you to do." And then he said, "You will find me, satajiduni," which means definitively, right? Min as-sabirin, right? From the ones who are continuously patient. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala depicted their action. He said, فَلَمَّا أَسْلَمَا, when both of them submitted. Okay, when both of them submitted. Now, one thing I want to point out, I'll bring this later on. So, once they both submitted, right? And Ibrahim alayhi salam put the forehead of his son forward. And the reason he did that is because he did not want to see the face as a father. He didn't want to look in the face of his son as he's slaughtering him. So he put his head forward, and as he brought the knife, he wanted to slaughter him. The knife did not go through, but rather all of a sudden Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called to him, and he said, قَدْ صَدَّقْتَ الرُّؤْيَا إِنَّ كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ إِنَّ هَذَا لَهُوَ الْبَلَاءُ الْمُبِينُ. This is the clear test. Now usually the bala', right? The bala' comes at the beginning of an action, not in the middle of the action. Okay? But over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continued to let Ibrahim alayhi salam continue with the slaughtering process, but just prevented the knife from cutting Ismail. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took the ability of the knife to cut Ismail alayhi salam. And the reason behind it is that this is a clear show, right, to everyone later on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us how Ibrahim alayhi salam and is willing to slaughter his son for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us that the love that Ibrahim alayhi salam has for Allah is greater than the love that he has for his son. There is no one humanly possible that is ever able to get himself to do something like this unless it is for something that is greater that they love. We will always sacrifice what we love less for what we love more. And I want you to think about this for a second. Anytime we, for example, are faced with a situation where Allah orders something and there's something we desire, what enables us to fulfill Allah's order and leave our desire is how much we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is that love, right? This is why it's important that complete iman is only achieved when Allah and His Messenger is more beloved to us than anything else in this world. More than our parents, more than our children, more than our wealth, more than our property, right? Because this is when we will be willing to sacrifice all of this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is when we're doing. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the story as an example of a manifestation of what true love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, right? And it clarifies that. And both of them submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And until this day, right, every single year, our acts of ritual are symbolic. They're very connected. Of course, on their own, they're acts of worship. But they are heavily connected to the whole message of submission, right? This is why Ibrahim alayhi salam, right, was considered a nation and his own ummah, right? Ibrahim alayhi salam was considered a prophet that all prophets will follow in his example. Right? And Ismail alayhi salam himself was willing to give up his life because he loved Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than himself. Right? It's a beautiful story of submission. طيب. We'll stop here inshallah because if I go to the next story it's going to take a bit longer. I think I covered everything almost I wanted to mention. Obviously there's certain lessons we can deduce here and there. You're more than welcome to kind of share or ask any questions. But inshallah we're going to stop here for today. Iqamah is at 10, which is good, and I think we still have some chai at the back and some kind of snacks, I guess. طيب, any questions? Comments, lessons we can learn? Yes, 2 questions. Tried to convince Ibrahim 3 times, yes. Both are there, but it makes more sense as he's leaving. It makes more sense as he's leaving. No, he was actually throwing pebbles. So he might have obviously he came in a form where Ibrahim alayhi salam can see him. Now you have to remember the shaitan can come in the form of a human being, right? And he did that quite often, like several times. Even the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, he came in the form of a human being to the people of Quraysh, right? Or in a form of human being to something else. So certain shayateen might have that ability. Some of them have the ability to come in the form of either a snake or a black dog or whatever the case is. Hold on. Any questions? Yes, Sheikh. So I can't hear you, Sheikh. Repeat that again. Yes. Yes. Yes, she was okay with him because remember, she said when she said this is an order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But she accepted Islam. She accepted Islam. So Sarah had taught her this was mentioned in the books of Sirah. Sarah had taught Hajar about Iman. And she taught her about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and she taught her how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Hajar was a person that was a righteous woman. She would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and she was a believer, right? And so she was a Muslim. And this is perhaps why Ibrahim alayhi salam later on married her. Wallahu a'lam. So it doesn't matter. So okay, let me put this. When you have Iman, it doesn't matter what background you're from. Right? Iman is one of those things that when it reaches a certain level, it empowers a person with the ability to even move mountains. Right? It empowers a person to stand in front and face things that are unimaginable and not be afraid of it. Right? And subhanAllah, it can happen so quickly and so fast, it's incredible. For example, the Saharat Fir'aun, the magicians of Fir'aun, right? These were people who were completely just engrossed in worldly desires. This is why when Fir'aun had asked them to challenge Musa, they said, do we have some, are we going to get some monetary benefits if we're the winners? He said, نعم وَإِنَّكُنَا مِنَ الْمُقَرَّبِينَ. He said, yes, not just that, but you're going to be close to me in terms of my ruling part and stuff like that. So this is all monetary. But once they realize that this is not magic, these are prophets, what do? خروا سجدا, right? They prostrated. Now, the point where their iman, the strength of iman shows, and how subhanAllah quickly they change from people who want worldly things and doing whatever they want and face a prophet with worldly desires, to now Fir'aun threatened them by death and he could execute them. And he just didn't say, I'm going to kill you. He said, لَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ فِي جُذُوعِ النَّخْلِ, I'm going to crucify you on the stems of a tree, right? And what do they say? Do whatever you want, right? We want the hereafter. And so iman, like when it becomes reaches a level, subhanAllah, it can empower a person extremely. Like it becomes so easy to submit. And this is why it's very important for us to always, always try to work and build that iman. And the Prophet ﷺ advised us to always be careful. He said, your iman will, like it depletes, it goes down. Increase your iman, right? Because this is our fuel, our internal fuel that enables us to do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so over here, these are beautiful examples of like, not just like, a prophet, two prophets, but also Hajar herself, right, showed that beautiful example of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By the way, you have to, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Hajar was not mentioned in here, right? So one of two things, either she had passed away, right, or she knew and she still accepted that her child would be slaughtered, right? But whatever the case is, if she's, we'll assume she's alive, the fact that she let this happen obviously shows more that she is, like how much submission she had to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. SubhanAllah. Time out? All right, go have your chai, inshallah. I've been ordered to end. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika.